Welcome everyone to the Petaluma Museum. My name is Joe Noriel, I'm the president, and this is our flight exhibition. Very happy to see you all. I think we're all anxious to really figure out what happened to Amelia Earhart. Certainly captured generations of a mystery and intrigue. And I was telling Tom, we've got the next best thing to Indiana Jones here, who has really spent a good portion of his life trying to figure out really that question and that answer. And apologize for this mic, it may go in and out, and Tom may have to just project. It's very troublesome. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Tom F. King, PhD, co-author of Amelia Earhart's Shoes, and author of 13 Modes, senior archaeologist, the International Group for Hysteric Aircraft.
Yeah, maybe, can you hear me in the back? Okay, then I will try to do without the mic. Well, thank you, Joe. Yeah, the International Group for Hysteric Aircraft Recovery. We think of ourselves fairly hysterically. I should say I'm particularly happy to be here because I have been doing archaeology for about close to 50 years. My grandson actually refers to, one of my grandchildren, refers to me as the mild Indiana Jones. Very mild by comparison. But I grew up here in Petaluma, and one thing that makes me particularly glad to be here today is, well, or any day, is that I really learned about archaeology right behind that column over there. Because that used to be where the stacks were in which there were archaeology books. And the librarians who lived out behind that desk that was out in the middle of the room at that point were very kind to me and stocked in lots of archaeology books. And I spent a great deal of time, I think there's probably sort of a smooth spot on that column where I kind of leaned up there and learned about archaeology. So I'm very happy to be here and to see a number of old friends, and I also have a lot of my family members here. Prue Draper in the back, Mary Nell McCann, who's a local Petaluma resident, my wife, Pat Parker. I'm very glad to see everybody. So without further ado, what I've been doing as a hobby for the last 23 years is working archaeologically on the disappearance of Amelia Earhart. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. We have not been pursuing Amelia sort of on every front with regard to every possibility as to what happened to her. We've been pursuing a particular hypothesis, what we call the Nikumaroro Hypothesis, built around the island of Nikumaroro, which you will learn more about here today than you probably ever wanted to know. A lot of our work was described in this book, which was published in 2004. I do have some copies for sale if anyone would like one after the talk. We've done a lot of work since then and are talking about what to do in terms of an updated publication. So we're talking about Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, often sort of a forgotten man, who went missing on the 2nd of July, 1937, over the Pacific while trying to circumnavigate the world in a Lockheed Electra 10E. What they were trying to do, they had initially started out to fly west from Oakland to go around the world as close as possible to the equator. They made it as far as Honolulu. On takeoff from Hawaii, they crashed, damaged the plane. It had to be brought back to Burbank for repairs, and they then took off going east from Oakland and followed the course that you see here on the map until on the morning of the 2nd of July, 1937, they took off from Lae, New Guinea for the third to the last leg of the trip. They were to fly across the Pacific to Howland Island, refuel there, go to Honolulu, go back to Oakland. This was the longest overwater leg they'd done. And Howland is a tiny, tiny, tiny little speck of coral out in the middle of the Pacific. The Coast Guard cutter Itasca was lying off the island to guide Earhart in. They heard messages from Earhart. The strength of signal indicated that they were within 50 miles or so. But they could never establish two-way radio communication. As a result, they couldn't do a radio direction finding fix, and they couldn't guide her into Howland Island. Earhart reported that she couldn't see the island. They had a message from her that said that. Then the radio messages ended. Of course, a huge search was laid on. The Itasca searched in the area. The USS Swan, which was in the vicinity, searched. The aircraft carrier Lexington and her battle group steamed into the area and launched planes and searched. The British searched in the Gilbert Islands. The Japanese searched in the Marshall Islands. The USS Colorado, a battleship with float planes on her fantail, steamed into the Phoenix Islands, which is particularly important to us because that's where we think she wound up, and they searched. No trace was ever found. So what happened? Over the decades since, there have been innumerable hypotheses about what happened to Earhart and Noonan. In many ways, the most efficient of them is what we call the crashed and sank school. That they ran out of fuel, they crashed in the ocean, they sank. Simple, but it doesn't quite explain everything, as we'll see. There's the hypothesis that she was a spy and was captured by the Japanese and eventually executed somewhere. There are variants on that theme, that she was Tokyo Rose, that she was actually a spy for the British, a variety of things. All supported by a lot of very interesting anecdotal evidence. A lot of person X said she saw American woman in captivity on Saipan, or in Chuuk, or in innumerable other parts of Micronesia, but only supported by anecdotal evidence. There are somewhat more bizarre theories. There's the one that she was captured by aliens, that she went off into another dimension. There's the premise that she was alive many years later in the Philippines, or even, poor Earhart, in New Jersey. None of these have been supported by any real evidence. So along comes TIGER, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery. TIGER is a very, very, very small, very, 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 very non-profit organization based in Wilmington, Delaware. And the mission of TIGER is basically to promote the preservation of historic aircraft and the solution of aviation mysteries. We have a website, www.tiger.org, that's got all kinds of wonderful stuff on it, and I'd certainly encourage you to visit that website. The Earhart Search Project is one of our major projects. So, when we talk about the Nikumaroro Hypothesis, what are we talking about? Nikumaroro is an uninhabited island southeast of Howland Island. A hypothesis, of course, is simply an educated guess that you can test somehow. Our hypothesis is that Earhart and Noonan landed on Nikumaroro and died there. And what we've been doing for the last 23 years is testing that hypothesis. So what is Nikumaroro? Well, first, where is it? It's pretty much dead center in the Pacific Ocean, right about there, in the Republic of Kiribati, what used to be called the Gilbert Islands. What is it? This is a satellite image. It's a coral atoll, formerly known as Gardner Island. It's in the Phoenix Islands group, part of the Republic of Kiribati. Formerly, it was part of the Crown Colony, the British Crown Colony of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands. It's about 4.5 miles long, about 1.5 miles wide, including its lagoon. A few highlights of its history. In 1929, a big freighter, the Norwich City, went up on the reef, and its remains are still there. There were 11 men lost. 3 bodies were recovered and buried. the survivors left a cache of supplies in case anyone else were ever shipwrecked on the island. In 1938, the Phoenix Island Settlement Scheme was launched under the direction and under the guidance, it was really the brainchild of the late Harry Maude, who was one of the real deans of oral history, history, anthropology in the Central Pacific. But at that time, he was a British colonial official who was concerned, was faced with the fact that population was increasing dramatically in the southern Gilbert Islands and in the Ellis Islands, and something needed to be done. The idea was to bud off colonies into the Phoenix Islands and create self-sustaining, copra-producing colonies on the various then uninhabited Phoenix Islands. And Harry, before he died, told me that he was extremely proud of having gotten this acronym through the colonial authorities. So they set up colonies on Nikumaroro, which was then called Gardner Island, on Monra, which was then called Sydney Island, and on Arona, which was then called Hull Island. This is a model of the Phoenix Islands. It's now the Phoenix Islands protected area. It's an internationally protected marine sanctuary. And these are its various islands, the mountains on which they sit. Monra was where one of the colonies was set up. Arona was another. And Nikumaroro was the third. There was also a population on Canton Island. It became a major U.S.-British base during World War II. As of the 1940s, on Nikumaroro, there was the Norwich City wreck. There was the colonial village of Rishash, right in here. And for a while, there was a U.S. Coast Guard Loran station on the southeast end of the island called Americi. That's a picture of the Loran station as it was under construction. It was manned by a group of very, very, very bored Coast Guardsmen. They referred to it as the Rock. They had a lot of interactions with the villagers. This is the entire population of the village as of about 1945. Okay, so why do we think Earhart wound up on Nikumaroro? First off, there's what we call the line of position argument. I'll talk about all these in a minute. The other thing we started out with was a body of post-loss messages, radio messages, received after she disappeared. From the research we've done in the last years, we've gotten quite a lot more evidence. Anecdotal, oral historical accounts, historical documentation, and archaeological data. So I'll try to go through each of these bodies of information in some kind of order so that you can judge for yourselves what you think of. First off, the line of position. Here's Howland Island, their destination that day, and the nearby island of Baker. Both were occupied at the time by students from Hawaii who were basically deployed there to clean the place up, make it available for Earhart to land on, and establish a U.S. claim because there was already a concern about the Japanese down here in the Marshall Islands. So here's their course, coming in from Lae, New Guinea, headed for Howland. At 7:40 in the morning, local time, Earhart sent a message to Itasca saying, "We must be on you, but cannot see you." And the strength of signal indicated they were maybe 50 to 100 miles out. An hour later, at 8:43 a.m., local, she said, "We are on the line 157-337. And that was the last message that is universally accepted as being from Amelia Earhart. Now, what that last bit means is this. This is 337 degrees. This is 157 degrees. This is a line perpendicular to the sunrise as it rose that day. When the sun rose, standard navigation practice at the time would be for Noonan to shoot the sun and establish their position with his sextant or his bubble octant that he was using for navigation. He would then establish a line parallel to their course, which he would advance by dead reckoning until it should run through their destination. If they couldn't see their destination, they would fly up and down the line until they got to their destination. So when Earhart says they're flying on 157-337, they're doing exactly what proper protocol called for at the time. And they were looking for the island. Now, if you project this line out to the north on 337 degrees, the first land you come to is the Kamchatka Peninsula, 4,000 miles away. If you project it to the south on 157 degrees, you come to Nikumaroro, or maybe to the nearby bird island of McKean. If you got your choice and you don't know, you know you've hit this line, but you don't know if you're north or south of Howland, you're not going to fly very far to the north. Pretty soon you're going to fly south, because that's going to get you either to Howland or Baker, or down into the Phoenixes, where you've got some place to put your plane on the ground. So the belief is that that's what they did. Now, the post-loss messages are discussed in tremendous detail in this book, published in 2006. I'm sorry I don't have any copies of it, but it is available on the Tiger website as well as from Amazon or whatever. It's by Rick Gillespie, the executive director of Tiger, and Rick has done an incredibly detailed analysis of the post-loss radio messages and of the search, all the events surrounding the search for Earhart. This is a tiny, tiny little sample of the post-loss radio messages heard by stations all over the Pacific and indeed elsewhere in the world. And you can see a lot of them are just carrier waves, a lot of them are weak, erratic, sometimes it's a voice. They're picked up all over the place. The Navy initially took these very seriously and thought that they clearly indicated that Earhart was alive somewhere. When they couldn't find her, they decided they were all hoaxes. Rick gives pretty good evidence, I think, in his book that they were probably not all hoaxes. One of the interesting pieces of evidence is that several of the messages were picked up by stations with radio direction finding. And this is those messages plotted, their plots all cross in the vicinity of what was then called Gardner Island, Nikumaroro. Now, there was no other radio in the vicinity to be transmitting these messages. In summary, there are over 180 messages that were received. 84% of them were recorded by professional radio operators. The vast majority were in the Central Pacific. Most of them were in the first 3 days after the disappearance, and then they taper off. The radio direction finding fixes point to the Phoenix Islands. So that's all in Finding Amelia, and a book that I certainly highly recommend. The Navy, taking all this very seriously and being pressured very heavily by George Putnam, Amelia's husband, who had good connections with the Roosevelt administration, sent the USS Colorado, the battleship Colorado, into the Phoenix Islands to search. The Colorado carried float planes, on her fantail, which could be launched by catapult. Yeah, it sounds weird, but that's what they did. So they flew over all the islands of the Phoenix Islands, and they searched. And they didn't find Amelia. And the official report was that they found nobody and saw nothing. But this was the report in a somewhat obscure ship's newsletter from the commander of the flight that flew over Nikumaroro, Gardner Island. They saw signs of recent habitation, But they circled, they zoomed, nobody came out of the bush waving a hanky, and they left. Yes, ma'am?
So I have a question. They never actually landed on the island to search?
No, they never actually landed on the island to search because there's no place to easily land and get off again. They had float planes, so they could have landed in the lagoon, but the lagoon is studded with coral heads, which would have ripped the float off the plane. And it would have been a very dangerous thing to do, and so it would not have been prudent for them to have put down unless they had some very good reason to do so. For the same reason, the captain of the Colorado was very uncomfortable steaming around in the Phoenix Islands because most of the islands were not well charted. There were a lot of uncharted reefs, and putting a great big battleship up on a reef in the middle of the Pacific Ocean would be a very unfortunate thing to have done for his career, among other things. So what we've done over the last 24 years is a whole bunch of research in a whole bunch of places. And our field research has been in the Phoenix Islands, mostly on Nikumaroro, over the last many years. We've also done a variety of technical studies, some of which I'll talk about here. Now let's just look at what Nikumaroro looks like. This is it. It's sort of your typical South Seas paradise. It's uninhabited. It was uninhabited in 1937, and it's uninhabited today. The Phoenix Island settlement scheme lasted from late 1938 through 1963. It has one of the most pristine coral reefs in the world, which is why it's now part of the Phoenix Islands protected area. Lots of marine animals of all kinds, lots of fish, lots of sharks, lots of turtles, lots of divers. Well, not lots of divers. The divers are there when we take them there. On shore, there are forests of the indigenous tree Pisonia grandis, known as buca locally. A lot of the island is covered with feral, coconut, and pandanus left over from the Phoenix Island settlement scheme colony. Major fauna are birds of all kinds, seabirds, a variety of kinds. This one's a fairy tern called Kia Kia by the Kiribati people. And what the island is famous for is its coconut crabs, Burgess latro, biggest arthropod in the world. Huge, nasty, very tasty, and endangered crab. Yeah, that one actually shows scale. There are also many, many, many more of these little guys, strawberry hermit crabs, and we'll see more of them a little later. There are also a few mammals in the form of the small Polynesian rat. Here are strawberry hermit crabs. They're the little ones. That's Rick Gillespie, who didn't quite get eaten. Much of the island is covered with scaevola, or mau, as the Kiribati people call it. It's a shrub that actually is used for a variety of purposes locally. It's got nice flowers, it's used for medicine and so on, but it forms an almost impenetrable thicket about 3 meters high through which one has to hack in order to see the ground and do archaeological survey. People sometimes ask, the island's only 4.5 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. You've been working there for 23 years. Why haven't you looked at the whole ground? Well, we haven't looked at the whole ground because it's covered with stuff like this. And that makes it a very time-consuming activity. And it's hot. That's sort of average temperature. We get there by ship, either from Fiji or from Samoa. This has been our preferred expedition ship for the last several expeditions, the Naya, out of Fiji. It's about a 5-day sail from Fiji, a 3-day sail from Samoa. So it's not an easy place to get to. We always have a representative of the Kiribati government aboard for fairly obvious reasons, because they insist on it. But also, they make sure that we're doing things right. Not only right politically, but right culturally. One of the things we are very careful to do whenever we arrive at the island is, as this gentleman, Katara, is doing, He's put his hand down on the wet sand and he's patting it on his cheeks. And you do that and let it dry until it falls off, so that when the spirits of the island come up and smell you, they'll know that you're from the island and you're okay and they won't hurt you. The first time we were there, we didn't do this and we got in a lot of trouble. And we had to go through a very elaborate apology ceremony, after which things got much better. So we're very careful to do this every time we arrive. We get around the island in rubber boats of various kinds to our various search locations. And the major search locations, we've been all over the island to some extent, but the major search locations are the Colonial Village, Rishash, and what we call the Seven Site. And we'll be talking more about the Seven Site in just a moment. Okay, so we've got anecdotal accounts, we've got historical documentation, we've got artifacts, we've got other archaeological observations. The first of the anecdotal accounts that attracted our attention was by a guy named Floyd Kills, who was a Coast Guardsman who was on the island in 1946 dismantling the Loran Station. And he gave an account to the San Diego Tribune in 1960, in which he said he knew where Amelia Earhart had wound up. She had wound up on this Gardner Island place. And he knew that because when he was on the island, he got a story from, quote, a native, who told him that in 1938 there were 23 island men and an Irish magistrate planting coconuts on the island. And they found a skeleton near one end of the island with a woman's shoe. Woman's shoes, American kind, is the way he described it, or the way his informant described it. The Irish magistrate thought of Earhart right away. Put the bones in a gunny sack, hopped in the island's four-oared boat and started rowing to Fiji, but came down with pneumonia. 24 hours out of Suva, Fiji, he died. Whereupon the superstitious natives threw the gunny sack full of bones overboard. That was the story. By the time we got this story, Kiltz was dead. His wife couldn't remember anything. The reporter who had done the story couldn't remember anything. And when we showed this story to a number of oral historians and asked them what they thought of it, they all said, yeah. But there were some funny things about this story. This is a 1942 air photo of the colonial village, Rishash. And I should say, this was a very British colonial village. As you can see, it was not just little grass huts. It was dead, straight streets, 7 meters across, lined with coral slabs, with administrative buildings around the perimeter, and a flagpole in the middle of the parade ground. It was a very spit and polish operation. Anyway, they had a four-oared boat, the Nemanganibuka, which was kept right there. And it was used not to row to Fiji, which is 1,000 miles to the south. Nobody would row to Fiji if they could possibly help it. But it was used to row back and forth to ships lying in the lee of the island to offload and unload people and supplies. There also, while there was never an Irish magistrate, there was the administrator of the Phoenix Island settlement scheme, who took over the post from Harry Maude. His name was Gerald Gallagher. He arrived on Nikumaroro in September of 1940. He died on Nikumaroro in September of 1941, shortly after returning from Fiji. His nickname, based on his heritage, was Irish. So no Irish magistrate, but an Irish-ish sort of administrator who didn't exactly die 24 hours out of Fiji, but died about 36 hours after getting back from Fiji. It seemed like there was something in the story, but we didn't know what it was, and we speculated a great deal about this for many years. When Harry Maude came to the island in September of 1937 with Eric Bevington, his colleague, to explore the island to see if it would be good for a colony, They reported, or Bevington reported, seeing signs of an overnight bivouac, what looked like somebody had camped overnight. Harry Maud, whom I spoke with about this before he died, said that he vaguely remembered it, and he remembered it as some piles of debris, and they were right there. We'll come back to that. John Mims, a pilot of a Navy PBY, who lives in, still alive, lives in San Diego, landed in the lagoon to service the Coast Guard station, and he ran into some colonists using aircraft control cable as fishing line. When he asked them where it came from, he said, oh, it came from an airplane that was here when we arrived. Veterans of the colony who now live in the Solomon Islands have told one of our colleagues, Dirk Ballendorf, when he visited them about now 15 years ago, that human bones had been found at two locations, up here and down here. But it was all so far in the past that they didn't really remember very much. In 1997, when a cyclone blew us off course and we wound up in Funafuti, in the Republic of Tuvalu, we met Tapani Ataiki, who had lived on the island in the 1950s. And she reported that there had been aircraft wreckage then washing up on this reef, the reef off the land unit known as Nusaran. And that the elders of the village had told the kids not to pick it up because of the ghosts of the man and the woman who had been in the plane. Her father reported wreckage in here. In 1999, we met Emily Sikuli in Fiji. Emily had been on the island in the early 1940s. She had left the island in 1941 to become a nurse in Fiji and had never returned. But her father, who had been the village carpenter, had showed her what she said was where the plane came down. It was kind of funny. I was interviewing Emily, and I asked her about the bones, because we knew that the carpenter had built the box and the bones went in. That's another story. We'll get to that. But in any event, I asked her if she knew where these bones had come from, and she said, oh yes, they're from where the plane came down. And I said, oh, and picked myself up off the floor and asked her if she could show me where the plane had come down, and she said, yeah, right there. Because there had still been wreckage that her father had shown her in 1940. That's the location. This is the remains of the Norwich city. And the wreckage that Emily described was right up in here. That's what it looks like today. There's no wreckage there. But it's a very nice flat place. It would be very easy to land a plane there. One of our members who's been on the island, who's an experienced, retired United Airlines captain, has said that he could put a 747 down on this reef flat. He couldn't get it off again, but he could put it down safely. Now, very recently, literally in the last year, we've been analyzing this photograph. This is a picture that Eric Bevington, Harry Maud's colleague, took as they were leaving the island in late 1937 after their exploring expedition. And we'd had this photograph for some time, but had always kind of focused on this area, looked at the Norwich city sitting here, and tried to think about, well, we really didn't think much of it at all. It was just an interesting period photograph. But recently, our forensic imaging specialist, who does this kind of stuff for all kinds of agencies that you don't want to know about, began a comprehensive reanalysis of all the old historical imagery. And he said, what about this thing? And we all said, what thing? And he said, this thing that's sticking up out of the water here. Well, we went back to England and got the original photograph. It's been scanned, it's been enhanced, and they've actually got a better scan than this of it now. But this is what it looks like. And it looks an awful lot like an aircraft landing gear. It's like there's a upended airplane down there with its landing gear sticking up. Analysis is still underway on this. There are now more fancy imaging techniques that are being applied to it. We'll see what further comes of it. This is actually Rick's plot, the plot done by Rick and a number of other people, that shows the post-loss radio messages superimposed on day and night and the height of the tide as we've been able to reconstruct tide heights over the time. And you see that most of the post-loss radio messages came during the night at low tide, when it was possible to wade out onto the reef. So what we think is the plane was out there on the reef for a period of time, and it was being used to transmit radio messages, and it eventually washed off the edge. Okay, so in summary, we have aircraft cable being used for fishing line, we have a bivouac reported, we have bones reported in 2 locations, we have aircraft wreckage reported there, and we have bones reported there. Okay, that's the anecdotal data. Historical documentation. In 1997, one of our members, working on a totally different project, was doing research in the National Archives of the Republic of Kiribati on Tarawa. And he came upon a file called Skeleton Human Finding of on Gardner Island with a proper coding system. And he wondered if we were interested in this. And we said, yeah, we're very interested in this. Turned out to be a file of telegrams between Gallagher on Nikumaroro and the authorities back in Fiji and on Ocean Island. You can't read this, but what it says is, a few months ago, a working party on Nikumaroro, Gardner Island, found a human skull, which they buried. And I, Gallagher, only recently learned about it. Research has now shown, a thorough search has revealed more bones and a number of other items, including a woman's shoe, size 10, and a sextant box with numbers on it. Gallagher thinks there's a slight chance this might be Earhart. The telegrams go on. There's correspondence back and forth. He says the working party buried the skull. It was found at the southeast corner of the island, associated with the remains of fire, bird bones, and turtle bones. The bones have been disturbed and damaged by coconut crabs. Now, I'll make a pitch for my other book, which I also have here, a novel that I've written about what we think happened and what built around the discovery of these bones in 1940. 13 bones. That's how many bones were discovered on the island. Gallagher says there are 13 bones with the remains of a fire, bird bones, turtle bones, a sextant box, Benedictine bottle, and shoe parts. In January of 1941, Gallagher sent all this stuff to Fiji, where Dr. David Hoodless, a medical doctor, renowned now in the Pacific, analyzed the remains. And he decided that they were the remains of an adult European male. As of 1941, the bones were being held by the doctor, by Dr. Hoodless, in the Fiji Medical School, in the Colonial War Memorial Hospital in Suva, Fiji, being held for government. At that point, the file ends. The record ends. We were able to find Dr. Hoodless's notes in the archives of the Western Pacific High Commission in London. They're now in New Zealand. And his notes included measurements of cranial characteristics as indicators of sex and measurements of limb bones as indicators of height. we had these measurements reanalyzed by our cooperating forensic anthropologists, Karen Burns, now at the University of Utah, and Dick Jantz at the University of Tennessee. And they concluded, based on comparison to a much more extensive database than Dr. Hoodless had access to, that assuming the measurements were all taken the way they would take measurements, the bones were most similar to those of an adult female of Northern European ethnicity, about 5'7" to 5'9" in height, which is a dead ringer for Earhart. Now those bones were last seen, last heard of, last recorded in the Colonial War Memorial Hospital in Suva, Fiji. I'll get back to that in a moment. We have done one small search in that building. We searched Dr. Hoodless's office and the space over his office. We searched his house, which is now the headquarters for married student housing. We searched his garage. We didn't find any bones. But the hospital is huge and has not been searched. We searched the bone collections of the Department of Anatomy of the Fiji School of Medicine. There were lots of bones, but when Dr. Burns measured them, none of them matched the measurements that Dr. Hoodless had taken. The sextant box has some interesting twists to it. Gallagher says it was found with the skeleton. He said there were two numbers on it, 1542 and 3500. They were stenciled on it. We always figured they were on the outside of the box. And we've looked at some 500 sextant boxes in collections around the world, and only found one that had numbers like this on the outside. It's that one in the National Museum of Naval Aviation in Pensacola, Florida. And it does contain a Ludolf sextant, and had the numbers 3547 and a couple of other numbers written on its outside. We thought that was pretty interesting, and thought it was particularly interesting when we checked the accession records and found that it had been the property of Fred Noonan. He had given it to one of his students, who had in turn donated it to the museum. Well, then we found, and this was basically through research on eBay, that the Navy, the U.S. Navy, bought a great many sextants toward the end of World War I, and then found that they were surplus because the war ended. Mostly from the Brandis Company. Many of them were modified by then Lieutenant, I believe, later Admiral Byrd, for use in aviation. These sextants had both a manufacturer's number and a Navy number, which were inscribed on the instruments and recorded on the insides of the boxes. And we said, we forgot to look at the insides of the boxes. But we've been looking very carefully and buying a lot of sextant boxes on eBay ever since. This is what one looks like. Yeah, that's what a sextant looks like, a navigational instrument, all that. We have a longer list now, but basically here's a list of manufacturers' numbers of Navy sextants, Navy numbers of the same sextants, and when we stick in the numbers of the Nikumaroro sextant, they fit in pretty well in the sequence. So we feel pretty confident that the box that Gallagher found, that Gallagher and the colonists found, was probably a Brandis sextant box that had been in the possession of the U.S. Navy and probably surplused in the 1920s. Now, did Noonan buy it? Don't know, but certainly possible. Then we get to the archaeology, which is really my gig. There are two primary places where we've done archaeological research: in the village and at the seventh site. This is the village, and this is just a summary of the work we've done there over the years, which I showed archaeologists. This is what the village, some of the surviving houses, buildings in the village look like. This is its cistern, still contains 20,000 gallons of water. This is Gallagher's grave. Gallagher died on the island and was buried, and this monument was put on his grave site, next to the flagpole in the middle of the parade ground. This was his house, where he lived and where visiting dignitaries stayed. It was referred to as the rest house. That's how it looked in 1940. 40. This is how it looked in 1989. This is Gallagher sitting in the rest house. This is a typical house site used by one of the colonists. All that's left now is a platform outlined in coral slabs. Occasionally there are standing house posts and a lot of artifacts scattered around. All kinds of artifacts, tin pots, sewing machines, bicycles, you name it. Lots and lots of stuff, including a lot of parts of airplanes. These are little pieces of aircraft aluminum that have been cut into pieces on their way to being handicrafts of one kind or another. Hair combs, for example. This is a larger piece of aircraft aluminum. This is a really large piece of aircraft aluminum. This is a piece of plexiglass whose thickness and curvature precisely matches the thickness and curvature of the windows in Earhart's Electra. Now, these pieces of aluminum all pretty much match the kind of aluminum used in Earhart's airplane, but they also match the kind of aluminum used in every other airplane of the period. So there's nothing that we've found yet in the way of aircraft parts that are really definitive, but it's obvious that the people of Nikumaroro were quarrying aircraft aluminum from a wreck somewhere and bringing it in to make into things. They made it into things like boxes. This is a box acquired by one of the Coast Guardsmen on the island in 1944-45. It's inlaid with aircraft aluminum. Okay, so that's the village. The Seven site is where we've been focusing more recently. It's down there at the southeast end of the island. You remember the Gallagher said that the castaway, the remains of what he referred to as the castaway, were found on the southeast end of the island, about 100 feet from the high tide line, under a tree, with the remains of fire, bird, and turtle bones. He was directed to do an intensive search. But like many of us in archaeology, he had problems doing his intensive search. His wireless went down, so he couldn't report what he was doing back to headquarters. The weather turned rotten. And a problem most of us do not have, there was a German raider in the area that kept shipping away from the island. As a result, we have no detailed report on his intensive survey. However, we have a not very good 1941 U.S. Navy air photo taken by a passing PBY that shows that vegetation had been cleared in a particular part of the southeast corner of the island, which is close to a natural seven-shaped clearing, and therefore we came to call it the Seven site. In 1996, before we had found the bones papers, Tiger did a survey of this location, and they found, under all the scaevola, a big hole in the ground, some bird bones, and artifacts from the colonial period. At that point, they said, well, this doesn't have anything to do with Earhart, so walked away from it. Then we found the bones papers and began to ask ourselves, is the Seven site where the bones were discovered? It's at the southeast corner. It was cleared around 1940 to 41 for some reason. Gallagher said the skull was buried and that he was going to dig it up. Perhaps the hole in the ground is where the skull was buried and subsequently excavated. The clearing and the colonial period artifacts perhaps relate to the search. So we've gone back to the Seven site 3 times now, in 2001, 2007, and 2010, to do further research. And what I'll talk about now is what we found. This is the hole once we got it cleared, before we excavated it. We figured, look, if the skull was in the hole, Gallagher says the skull had 5 teeth when it came out of the hole. Skulls have more teeth than that. there may be teeth left in the back dirt of the hole or in the hole itself. Teeth are excellent reservoirs of mitochondrial DNA. If we can find a tooth, we can find out whose tooth it was. Well, so we excavated that hole like no hole has ever been excavated before or since. We put it all through 1/4-inch screen, we put it all through 1/8-inch screen, we dug it very, very carefully, we found no teeth. But while we were concentrating on the hole, this is a cross-section of the island at the location of the 7th site. We were digging a hole right in here. The wind blows from this direction, trade wind. It was really hot in that hole. So we'd go to rest up on the top where the wind blew and where it was cool and breezy. That's where we go to have our lunch. And that's where, the first day, I reached down and picked up this thing and said, "What's this?" And Rick said, "Oh, well, it looks like a moose antler." And I said, "I don't think it's a moose antler." And we decided that what it probably was part of a turtle shell, which indeed it was. And we immediately got down on the ground and began looking around and began finding lots and lots of turtle bones, fish bones, bird bones, and charcoal. There had been a fire there. In other words, we had found under a tree, incidentally, of the same kind of tree that Gallagher said the bones were under, we had found remains of a fire with bird bones, fish bones, turtle bones. So we excavated 3 fire features that year, 2001. We also did a bunch of other work on the site. This is the area we cleared. In 2001, we found no human bones, no human teeth. But we found 5 fire features and excavated 3 of them. They had fish bone, bird bone, turtle bones, and various artifacts. There were other artifacts scattered over the site. And there was a lot of sheet metal, a lot of corrugated iron spread out on the site. There was evidence of colonial period activity, maybe logging, maybe coconut planting. In 2007, we went back, we had to re-clear the site. Scaevola had grown back up. We had better tools this time, cleared it faster, cleared a bigger area. And we excavated 2 more fire features. Mapped the site carefully. This is the map. These brown things are corrugated iron, sheets of corrugated iron. This is a scatter of bird bones. This is another. These are our excavation units. These are various shell features. We also did air photography using kite aerial photography. If there are archaeologists in the audience, I really recommend this. This is a marvelous technique. Gets you great aerial photographs at very low cost. We also scanned the site with ultraviolet light because bones fluoresce in ultraviolet light. And of course we did the usual archaeological excavations. What did we find? We found 2 more fire features called WR and SL. We found fish bones, bird bones, glass, ferrous metal, a variety of other artifacts. Here are some of the artifacts. Out of the WR fire feature, there were these 2 very interesting glass bottles. This is a patent for this one was issued in 1933. This is a pre-war beer bottle. The 2 bottles were melted on the bottom, so they'd been apparently standing up in the fire and then had broken. A piece of wire associated with them. What we think was happening here was that somebody was trying to purify water. And they were trying to heat these bottles, boil the water, maybe even distill from one bottle into another bottle, dragging them around with the wire, and they broke. They both are apparently pre-World War II bottles. They were standing upright, so we think it was an attempt at water purification. We found this little item, which is a complete snap from some kind of clothing. Snaps were invented in the late 19th century in Germany or possibly in the US. There's some debate about that. But they were used in ladies' clothing in the 1930s, among other things. Ferrous metal is what I'm working on particularly, and all I can say is we got a lot of it, and we're not sure what it is. We found a zipper pull. It's a Talon zipper, made in the United States, dates to the 1930s. It is apparently not military. Earhart wore zippered pants, zippered slacks, zippered jacket. There's also a zippered bag in the inventory of the stuff that was aboard the plane. But we have not yet found an obvious match for this in any of the photos. We found a piece of a pocket knife, the inside spine of a pocket knife, which turned out to be made by the Imperial Cutlery Company of Providence, Rhode Island, sometime 1930 to 1945. Interesting thing about this is that it had apparently been used to try to pry something. Like after the knife had broken, somebody had used it to try to pry something open. We now think we know what they were trying to pry open. One of the most interesting complexes of things we found was this. Two little pieces of glass, thin, flat glass with beveled edges. One found in 2001, the other in 2007. They fit together. They form a square. And we found three of these strange little tabular pieces of what we call technically red stuff. When the red stuff was analyzed, it turned out to be most likely an early 20th century cosmetic. It appears to be rouge. This is a compact that Amelia Earhart owned. She obviously didn't take it with her on the flight because it's in the museum at Purdue University. Analyzing the rouge from we couldn't get rouge from that compact because the museum wouldn't let us. But we got another compact of the same period, same manufacturer. This is the analysis of its rouge. This is the analysis of the red stuff from Nikumaroro. Not the same, but pretty close. These are the three big tabular pieces of rouge overlaid on a mundane compact rouge compartment. Clearly they fit with plenty of room. Now this is another compact that we picked up on eBay. We don't know the manufacturer, but it's from the 1930s. These are our two pieces of glass overlaying on its mirror. It's a perfect match. So we're pretty sure that what we have here are the remains of a compact with a mirror and rouge. Earhart, by the way, was known to carry a compact. She told people that she always had to be prepared for the press, and she therefore carried what she needed to make herself look good. Very interesting complexes of shellfish. We have a bunch of butter clams, and we actually think that was what was probably being opened with the little broken knife. And then several clusters, two clusters of giant clams, Tridacna. They are very giant. They're about like that big. And there's a bed of these guys in the lagoon. The interesting thing about this particular cluster, cluster 1, this is cluster 2, but cluster 1, whoever was trying to open these shellfish was using a tool like this. We found two of them on the site. They were trying to open it by prying the clam from the hinge side, which doesn't work. And they soon discovered that it didn't work because many of them had been opened this way. They'd been held in the hand with a big rock and gone, pfft. That's not the way a local person would open a Tridacna clam. But it's interesting that the great cooking, your heroine.
Julia Child?
Julia Child. Thank you. Brain freeze. Julia Child says that the way you open an Eastern oyster is from the hinge side, by prying from the hinge side. Earhart did clams and oysters on the East Coast. The fish and bird bones and turtle bones have been analyzed by Dr. Sharon Jones at the University of Alabama. She says it's a remarkable collection. It's a sort of random, almost random collection of different species available on the Nikumaroro Reef. It's like somebody was just out kind of picking them up haphazardly. This is, again, not what a local person would do. They know the fish. They know which ones are good, which ones are bad. They'd be much more careful about it. Okay, finally, the most recent work we've done, just last year, and we're running along, so I'll try to finish this up. What we did this last year were two things. We did a search with remotely operated vehicles down to 300 meters on the face of the reef to see if we could find any airplane parts. We did an automated underwater vehicle search and towed sonar search of the lagoon. And we worked at the 7 site. The ROV search, this is the ROV, that's the AUV. The AUV found nothing. There was nothing in the lagoon. The ROV, we had anticipated that the reef profile looked something like this, and if we worked down to about 300 meters, we'd possibly find something. Well, it turned out that the reef profile is like that. It drops off almost sheer to 300 meters and then begins to taper off. So we didn't find much, though there's some new analysis going on of the photography from the ROV that may show something, but we didn't find anything definitive in the reef search. At the 7 site, we cleared the site, and then we basically excavated the whole stinking thing. We laid out a series of 2-meter lanes. I should say that everything we found on the site has been in the top 10 centimeters, and there are reasons for that that we don't need to go into here. But we basically excavated by trowel down to 10 centimeters in all these lanes and recorded everything we found. Everything was shot in with a total station, and anything that looked like it might conceivably have DNA was collected under sterile conditions. These are the excavations underway, and yes, everybody lay down most of the time. It was hot. Basically, we did this. It's one of the terrible things about archaeology that it's inherently destructive, and so we are pretty much destroying the site, but there's not much else to be done. We supplemented the excavations with ground-penetrating radar, ultraviolet scanning, and metal detecting. That's the ground-penetrating radar underway, which didn't reveal much. That's the ultraviolet scanning. What did we find? We found that there are, what we've basically done is excavated most of the whole site. We found 6 general clusters of fire features, bird bones, mollusk features, and a lot of artifacts. We found buttons, pencil leads, possible battery, glass bottle shards from a Menon bottle, an ointment pot, and more of the jackknife. This is the battery. Surprised the devil out of me when I dropped it out of its bag and it opened up and all this fluid started coming out. This is the Menon bottle. See the N, sort of Art Nouveau lettering. We've been able to match that up. This is the ointment pot, which came up in 3 parts, widely scattered over the site. Interesting thing about it is that yet apparently the closest match we've been able to find is with something called Dr. Berry's Freckle Cream, which was being marketed from the early 20th century through sometime in the 40s or maybe later. Came in bottles like this. We have not been able to acquire one of these bottles, so please, if in one of your chicken houses or someplace you have a bottle like this sitting around, let me know. We've not actually been able to put our hands on one of these bottles. We have gotten hold of a box that one of them came in. And our ointment pot fits perfectly in this box. Earhart, we know, was very concerned about her freckles. And take that for what it's worth. We found most of the rest of the jackknife. Not the blades, but most of the rest of it. And this is a plot of all the various different kinds of artifacts as they were scattered over the site. Now, you can see that there's a big hole right here that we've not excavated, and that's something we want to do in the future. We've also had some disappointments. We found what we thought was leather. And we thought, gee, that's really interesting, particularly since this leather seems to have white tinting on it, white dye of some kind. That's particularly interesting because Earhart on the world flight was wearing shoes that were white. Well, when we had it analyzed, it turned out to be fiberboard with white lead paint. Now, we don't know why it was there. It's like this corrugated iron. We don't know why it was there. There's building material on the site. We found a number of things that we thought might have DNA, either touch DNA, just from somebody touching them, or in the stuff itself. We found some possible human bone fragments, 3 bone fragments that might be human. And then we found glass shards, buttons, and cloth that we thought might have touch DNA. Those are the buttons. This is the cloth still in its sterile bag. No DNA in any of them. This is one of the bones. This is what we call the Fickle Finger. It is apparently a phalange. It's either from a human or from a sea turtle. And we can't be sure which. There's DNA in it, but it's insufficient to sequence, according to the DNA lab at the University of Oklahoma, so they are holding it, looking toward better techniques in the future. Now, this is another thing that we actually found in 2007 that turns out to be most likely what we call technically a coprolite. That's a piece of poop. And how it's been preserved, we don't know. But it has DNA in it, and it is being analyzed as we speak. The rouge, we found a number of more small little slivers of rouge. They're all in the vicinity of what we call the SL feature over here, though 2 of the big pieces were in the WR feature over here. We have a lot of analyses still in progress. The DNA on the coprolite, we're working on the glass containers, identifying them, and also getting their contents analyzed. We've got a little piece of foil, what may be a pin, that are being ID'd. We have shellfish being analyzed, bones of all kinds being analyzed. Now there's a complication in all this. That's where the 7th site is. We think that's where the castaway was found in 1940. This is where the Coast Guard station was. We know the Coast Guardsmen were on the site because the most common, the absolute most common artifact we find on the site is an M1 carbine cartridge. They were out there doing target practice and shooting birds. Remember, that's what the Coast Guard station looked like. That's where the 7th site is. This is what the Coast Guard station looks like today. And there's a lot of junk scattered around on the Coast Guard station, including bottles and jars, none of them exactly matching what's on the 7th site, but still stuff of the period. So the Coast Guard station is a plausible alternative source. And we've got all these weird construction-related things on the site. All this corrugated iron, a roll of asphalt siding. This is what the corrugated iron looks like on the site. This is the asphalt siding. We have this stuff with white lead paint. Somebody was building something on that site sometime in the 1940s or 1950s, and that's a source of confusion. So, what we need to do is ask the people who were there. The people who were there are now living in the Solomon Islands. The people from the colony, when it was abandoned in 1963, moved to two villages, Nikumaroro village on Magana Island and Rawaki village on Gizo Island. So, we're sending a team in August of this year to the Solomon Islands, working with Baro Correa, who was born on Nikumaroro Island, grew up in Nikumaroro village, has recently retired as an accountant for Air Niugini in Honiara. He's going to help us go to the village, interview the people, and ask them basically what the devil they were doing on the Seven side in the 1940s and 50s. We may find out other things. There apparently are still some people alive there who were around at the time the bones were found. So where we stand, the line of position argument, the post-loss signals point to Nikumaroro, aircraft wreckage is reported on the reef and in the lagoon, airplane parts have been found in the village, skeleton was found on the southeast end with all these indicative artifacts. What we think happened was this. They hit the line of position, out of sight of Howland, probably to the south. They couldn't establish contact with Itasca. They flew south along the line of position. They would have come up on Nikumaroro at about between 10 and 11 o'clock a.m. Our tidal hindcasting indicates that the tide at that time was low, but coming in, the reef flat was exposed. We think they looked around for a suitable place to land, and they landed on the reef north of Norwich City. So they land on the reef safely, get off the plane. They're able to send radio messages from the plane when it was dark and reasonably cool, and when they could wade out to the plane over the next 5 or 6 days. Meanwhile, the tides are steadily getting higher, because when they landed it was a neap tide and it was going toward a flood tide. At about 6 days after the second, it got to be a flood tide, and we think the plane then washed over the reef, upended, sticking its wheel up in the air, accounting for the photograph that Bevington took. We think that Noonan and Earhart then possibly found the cache that the Norwich City survivors had left, and then eventually set out exploring the island and figuring out how they were going to live there, since nobody was coming to find them. Maybe particularly looking for water. And one of them, probably Earhart, we think, wound up at the Seven site, where she camped for a time and then died. Aircraft wreckage, meanwhile, floats south along the reef face, and every now and then is coughed up onto the reef surface to be collected by the villagers. But we don't have any aircraft wreckage yet in the reef or in the lagoon. The airplane parts we found in the village are not conclusive. We haven't found the bones, and there may be alternative explanations for what we found at the Seven site. So what we're planning now, we're completing our lab work on the 2010 data. We intend to do archival research in Honiara in the Solomons and on Tarawa. Oral historical research this August at Rawaki and Nikumaroro villages. A scan of the deeper reef down to about 1,000 meters is being planned. That requires a much better ship than we've had, with dynamic positioning, able to send a much better ROV to a much greater depth. And we'd like to complete excavation at the Seven site. A search of the Colonial War Memorial Hospital in Fiji is now scheduled for next month. We'll have a team leaving middle of May, early May, to spend the better part of the month in Fiji working with the colonial authorities and the U.S. Embassy to search the hospital, which is a humongous, huge Victorian pile. And in August, we have our group going to the Solomons to interview people in the two villages. Tentatively, a return to Nikumaroro to at least do deep water searching and possibly to do work at the Seven site is scheduled for 2012. Funding, depending on funding. And that's where you can get further information from our website and from our various books. And with that, I have talked quite enough, and I'd be happy to take any questions, comments, or suggestions about where she really is. Yes, sir?
Did you, were the aircraft parts analyzed to determine what alloy?
Yeah, the U.S. Naval Academy non-destructive testing lab has run a lot of tests on the aluminum. And they can basically say, yeah, it really is aircraft aluminum. But
From that period?
from that period, yeah. But the trouble is that Canton Island became a major U.S. British base during World War II. And so there were lots of airplanes there. And we know there was a B-24 that went down on Canton Island, or in the water off Canton Island. And we have pieces of B-24 on Nikumaroro. They are obviously, and we can match them up, they are parts of B-24. So obviously they were bringing in some airplane parts from Canton Island, and that really confuses things.
Why do you only dig 10 inches or whatever?
Why only 10 centimeters?
I'm sorry?
Why only 10 centimeters?
10 centimeters.
Oh, why only 10 centimeters? Why only 10 centimeters? The island is basically made up of coral rubble. There's a coral substrate and then coral rubble, the rubble being anywhere from finger to fist size. And so it forms a very loose sort of a matrix. What seems to happen is that stuff filters down to about 10 centimeters. And at that point, the material is packed enough that stuff stops, at least bigger stuff stops. And so we found that there's literally a layer of artifacts down at about 10 centimeters. Below that, it may be that there's stuff, but we don't find it. It's probably such small stuff that it's filtered on through and gone far beyond where we could find it.
I will probably just miss this. What's the study at the hospital next year or in August?
The bones. Looking for bones.
Bones. Oh, for the bones. Yeah, I'm sorry. The bones were last reported. The bones that were found in 1940 were last reported in 1941 in the possession of Dr. Hoodless at the hospital. And so, you know, that's sort of the last spot we have, the last piece of evidence we have for them, and so that's a place to look. We have been into Dr. Hoodless's own office and into the crawl space over it, but we've not been able to search the rest of the hospital, and that's what we're now going to be able to do.
Do you think they had enough gasoline to make it to that island at 10:30 in the morning?
Enough fuel?
Yeah.
We think so. That's something that people debate very hard, and there are some of the crashed and sank theorists. Let's say that 3 times quick. Argue that they didn't have enough fuel, and there's no way that they could make it to Nikumaroro. But the way they managed to set it up so they didn't have enough fuel is that they invent ways that the fuel evaporated on the ground at lay. They invent headwinds that were not recorded. They invent strange navigational glitches that sent them off in wrong directions. If they flew efficiently, if they followed the fuel management plan that Earhart had, they should have had plenty of fuel. Yes, sir?
Assuming that Earhart got onto the island alive.
Yes.
Why do you think she died?
Okay, she got off the island alive. Why did she die? Well, there are a lot of things on that island that can kill you. It's a very beautiful tropical paradise kind of island, but there are stonefish that are poisonous. There are bacteria that will kill you. If you get a wound and it goes septic, it'll kill you. And of course there are sharks and things like that swimming around. So there are a lot of things that can kill you, but the most likely thing is water. There is no source of water on the island except rain. There's also, as in on many coral islands, a freshwater lens that sort of floats on the salt water down under the ground. But you got to dig for it. And you usually got to dig a meter or so to get it, and you've got to dig in the right place. And to dig, you need a shovel. And she didn't have one. So if digging for water would have probably not been feasible, she would have been dependent on rainwater. And the rains come and the rains go, and sometimes the rains go for a long period of time. So we think probably lack of water was what killed her.
Do you have the rainfall for that period? Or
Not well. The thing is that rains in that area, in the Central Pacific, occur in the form of squalls. And you can see them coming. Here will come a cloud with this rain falling out of it. And maybe it hits you on the island and maybe it doesn't. But there's no kind of weather data that would give us enough information to let us know that there had or had not been regular squalls over Nikumaroro during July and August of 1937.
So depending on the weather patterns, would the rainfall be coming from the southeast or
Would the rainfall have been coming from the southeast?
would the weather patterns be coming from there?
Most of the time, this is in the trade wind zone, and the trade wind's blowing out of the northeast. And so most of the weather is moving northeast, southwest, most of the time. The big storms mostly come in on western winds, out of the west and southwest. So it sort of the pattern reverses.
So back at the very beginning, when you had the line that they would have followed going south, which seems logical, so no one on those two ships and any other ships that were pulled in to do the research dropped a boat and went to the island that was so logical to check it by foot. Is that what you're saying?
It's what I'm saying, that none of those ships dropped a boat to go ashore and check the most logical island. Yeah, basically that's. And again, there were reasons for that. The Colorado was in Pearl Harbor on a midshipman training cruise, and they thought that they were about through, and all of a sudden they got sent down to the Phoenix Islands. And we have some correspondence from some of the people aboard the Colorado who had nothing good to say about Earhart at all. They were not at all happy about being sent down to the Phoenix Islands. But that, it wasn't a fit of pique that kept them from searching Nikumaroro. The pilots didn't land because it would have been very dangerous to do so.
I got that part.
Okay, the captain of the Colorado probably just didn't want to get very close to any of these islands because of the danger of running into something and wrecking his ship. And he may have had an attitude problem toward Earhart, I don't know. But he was being duly cautious of the great big piece of government property that he was maneuvering around the Pacific. And his pilots came back and said, we didn't see anything.
Well, if that's all true, then if they actually did see something, how are they going to rescue them?
Okay, if they had seen something, if Earhart had come running, here I am, what would they have done? Well, at that point, they doubtless would have risked bringing the ship in close enough to drop a boat and go ashore. But that didn't happen, and on balance, they decided not to pursue it. Because remember also that they didn't know that Earhart was down there. She could have been north of Howland Island. She could have been floating in the ocean someplace. And so they were balancing things. Now, her husband, George Putnam, believed quite firmly that Earhart was on one of those islands. Not necessarily Nikumaroro, but he thought she was alive on one of the islands. And he lobbied the British, and he lobbied Roosevelt, and he lobbied the War Department, and he pushed every button he could possibly push to get the search continued. And basically, the Department of War decided we've gone as far as we're going to go. And they quit. Yes, ma'am.
You haven't touched on one of the theories that Earhart went that way because she was going to disappear on purpose so that they could search those islands for the Japanese occupation. Could you touch on that?
Okay, the theory that she went the way she went on purpose so that and intended to get lost so that the U.S. could search the islands in case the Japanese were doing something. Well, you know, anything's possible. She may have gone off into another dimension. There's no evidence of that. And you know, there's an old rule in science called Occam's razor, where you don't perpetuate more complexity in an explanation than you need to. That you try to select the least complex solution. And when you start positing that Earhart was conspiring with FDR to find out what the Japanese were doing in the Pacific, it just gets terribly, terribly complicated. And there seem to be, we think there are simpler explanations. If none of those simple explanations work out, then you begin looking at the complicated ones. But we don't see a reason to look at the complicated ones yet.
Tom, can you speak to the competency of Ed Noonan?
I'm sorry?
Competency of Ed Noonan.
The competency of Fred Noonan. Yeah, one of the stories about Noonan is that he was an alcoholic, that he was drunk all the time, and that that undoubtedly led them in the wrong direction. Noonan drank, no question about that. May have drunk to excess at times, we don't know. But there's no real evidence that he was a belligerent alcoholic. And whatever else he did, he apparently got them close enough that, you know, again, the strength of signal, the radio messages indicated they were within 50 or 100 miles. Noonan, nobody really expected Noonan to navigate them right, pinpoint to Howland Island. You couldn't do that with celestial navigation in an airplane. He was getting them close enough so that they could get radio direction finding fixes and be guided in. Now, what I haven't mentioned is that there's evidence that they lost their belly antenna as they were taking off from Leyte. As a result, they had very poor radio communication. And there were a number of other problems that Rick Gillespie goes into in great detail in his book about how they coordinated with the Coast Guard about how they were going to send signals, when they were going to send them, and so on. Suffice to say that it was the inability to establish radio communication that killed them. Noonan got them close to the island. He got them as close as he was supposed to get to the island. Beyond that, it was the radio, problems with the radio that made it impossible to